Hello, this is Dan again, and I am going to go ahead and do the next part of my video on how I essentially decided to adapt a MGTOW philosophy after a lot of the things that I've experienced over the last several years, through my 20s up until now. And, I mentioned that in my mid 20s, I had gotten myself into a situation where I was really painted into a corner with having my own kind of health problems from a neurological standpoint and, trying to help the situation that I had after my, I shouldn't say the situation I had, but the situation that existed after my grandmother had a pretty serious stroke. I'd always been close to my grandparents, so, I really wanted to help out in that situation so that things could get back as closely as they could to normal. And at the same time, my ex girlfriend basically had broken up with her fiance, or I should say, her fiance dumped her. And, she claimed that, I was really the right one for her, that, she should never have left me for this other guy, essentially, even though she always kind of wanted to be with this guy, and then it didn't work out between her and him. And she made this claim that despite the issues that I was facing, that we would get it through it, that we would get through it together, and that I could rely on her. Looking back on it now, it's funny because I would never believe that kind of thing, knowing what I know now about what it is that women look for in relationships and what it is that men in contrast look for in relationships, and the different things that men and women value and how women see men as utilities. But, at that point, I wanted to believe that we would get through it together, that, I could get my life together. I could somehow work on getting my own neurological issues resolved, and at the same time helping the whole family situation, um, with my grandmother having dementia, and just trying to get things back to a positive kind of level, trying to bring things back together to where I could move forward with my life in some fashion. And, I really believed that my girlfriend was going to help me with this. And, I convinced myself that this time things were going to be different, and that somehow I would try, you know, as best I could, and she was more mature now, so we'd have a different result. And I convinced myself basically that I would be rewarded for being a quote unquote nice guy. And I'll probably do a video in particular about that topic, about how nice guys really do finish last. I think that's a red pill in itself that men have to kind of discover for themselves, that nice guys really do finish last, and it's a game that will cost you, if you decide to play that nice guy role. If you decide to be, a white knight or a Captain Save-A-Ho, in relation to my girlfriend, that's pretty much what I was. I was her backup guy. I was her Captain Save-A-Ho. And I really wanted to be a good person. I really wanted to say, I'm an adult now. I'm in my mid 20s. I'm going to handle whatever life throws at me as best I can, and still not put myself first, even though I had my own health issues. And so this went on for just a few months where, my girlfriend and I would get together, and it would be sort of a respite from the whole situation with my family, trying to kind of manage my grandmother's health, in particular with my grandfather, doing whatever he could to make the proper adjustments to take care of that. And I'm not going to go into any more details on that because there's really no reason to, but it was a challenge for everybody involved. I'll just say that much. So basically, you know, my girlfriend and I were still seeing each other, but not as often as we would have liked. And everything seemed to be fine for like maybe 2 or 3 months. And then the same thing kind of started to happen where, it became all about her. I want you to move in with me. I think you need to get out of that situation with your grandparents. I think that you know, should focus on us. It was, which really was code for focusing on her. And that's not an exact quote of what she would say, but that was the implication in everything that she would do. And she began to get more and more frustrating to deal with. She basically would say, how can we have a future together and all that? And it's just like she knew very well what my situation was. And she said that we would get through it together. But after just a few months of that situation continuing, and throughout this time, I was still going to doctors, I was still going to chiropractors. I was trying to figure out what had gone wrong with my system from a neurological standpoint. And, it's not like I totally gave up on having a future with my girlfriend, but it was just clearly a reasonable person, in particular, a reasonable man, would be able to look at this situation and say, well, you signed up for this and you knew that things weren't going to change in the short run. But instead, my ex girlfriend just became, my girlfriend at the time, now my ex girlfriend, just became more and more selfish, and it became more and more about her. And she would even say things like, my life is hard compared to yours. She would actually make the comparison of being at this time and just a typical, very busy, but typical college girl versus me not knowing what's wrong with my health, trying to help my family situation, and just really having my potential career just totally stopped, dead in its tracks. And yet, to her, her life was worse because she had the stress of being a college student. And I was a college student for 4 years. I know what it's like, and it was nothing like what I went through later on after my own health became problematic, and after you know the other issues that I've mentioned started to go downhill, started to become a problem. And so there's no comparison between being in pain and being sick a lot of the time on a fairly constant basis, and just knowing that you are going to have to try your best to get back on track somehow, and going to doctors by yourself and trying to help your family situation versus being a college student and being busy and having just regular normal stress that young college students have. But in her mind, she was so solipsistic. And of course, I didn't realize this then, but she was so solipsistic and so selfish that, she would actually say, you don't know what my life is like. You don't know my stress level. And it's just like, seriously? That's the only level of support that you can give me after saying that we're going to get through these problems together. And so finally, it just got worse and worse. And it got to a point where I couldn't ignore her and make problems go, I make the fights that we would have, the arguments that were basically over nothing, go away. These arguments just became more and more frequent. I'd found out before that I couldn't confront her because she would just get more upset. I couldn't reason with her. I couldn't fight with her and argue effectively. It didn't make any difference what I did. And it finally got to a point where we had one fight that was so stupid, and she just said, we were messaging each other on Skype, and I was playing a game on the computer, and she was watching TV, which in itself is totally pointless. But I remember this situation clearly, and because it was the last fight that we had, as a couple anyway, and it basically was the last fight that we had, where I was playing a silly Facebook game, I guess, that she could do, which was just to go to bed mad and not talk to me anymore. And then the next day, she acted like nothing had happened. And at this point, after having, a relationship with her for 6 months or maybe a little better, I just said, you know what, forget it. And it wasn't even a matter of me wanting to end the relationship because I still was completely blue pill. It was a matter of saying, you know what, I have too much to deal with. It was almost like an involuntary response. It's just like I had so much to deal with on an everyday basis. I wasn't feeling well. It wasn't that I was constantly busy, but just being in the situation that I was in and having her complete lack of support. And it's just like it got to be too much. There was no reason for me to put up with her bullshit on top of the family situation and my own personal health situation, and on top of just my life not moving in a positive direction. She was not helping it move in a positive direction. She wasn't helping me get through it. With any kind of support. And so I finally just said, if this is how it's going to be, I don't want to be a part of this anymore. And she's just like, all right, fine. So are you breaking up with me? And I'm like, yeah, I'm breaking up with you. And that was the last time we were ever together. Because I just, again, it wasn't that I wanted to break up with her. It wasn't that under other circumstances that I had gotten wise enough that I wouldn't put up with her shit anymore. That wasn't the case. The case was that I was just so overwhelmed that I just said, you know what, I can't handle this. Goodbye, basically. And it ended up being one of the best decisions I've ever made in my young life. My sort of young life at this point, I guess. I'm getting old. But I just finally got so overwhelmed that I just decided that I'd had enough. And basically from that point, we had these silly situations still. Like, I didn't completely end communication with her right away, even though we were done as far as a couple goes. But, she would say, oh, I still want to be friends. And then she'd message me when she was drunk and say, oh, we're not going to be friends. And, then all of a sudden, one of the people she was close to, one of her friends from school, like got cancer and died, which is a sad thing. But ultimately, she messaged me and was like, I need your support, blah, blah, blah. I really still wanted to be friends. And then, just a few weeks after that, after her friend died and she supposedly needed me so badly, she started dating another guy again. And it's just like, at that point, I just blocked her on all my social media and I was done with her. And there was a final situation that happened a few years after that, but it was irrelevant. At least it's relevant, but it's something that happened after I was introduced to MGTOW. And I basically just said, I have no desire to talk to you. You're married to another man at this point, which she was, as of a couple years ago, at least. And, I just said, hey, there's no reason for you to talk to me. We're not going to be friends. There's nothing left to discuss. What I should have said all along after things initially didn't work out all those years ago. But nonetheless, at that point, she was essentially out of my life. But like I said, after that breakup, after our last breakup, I still really did not understand what my expectations were as a man, why things went awry so badly, um, and just how to get out of the situation that I was in by viewing my alternatives, I guess, in a better light. And basically, I was just, I totally didn't get it. I still really didn't understand what happened, but I was smart enough at this point to finally realize that, what, there's something that I'm missing here. And this is really a key part, I think, in why it is that I found the manosphere and the MGTOW community. Um, I knew that there was something that I did not completely comprehend. I knew there was a missing piece to the puzzle in my history with this woman. And basically what I'm talking about is that I knew when she said, "Oh, I love you," or "we'll get through it together," and stuff like that, that she meant what she was saying. It's not as if she was a good enough actress to actually say, "Oh, I just want to be with you, and I really think that, you are my soulmate, and it's meant for us to be together." Like, she actually convinced herself of that. And I let her convince me of that as well. But the key here is that I realized there was some sort of disconnect. That on one hand, she would say, "Oh, I love you, and we'll get through everything together," and mean it. But then her actions afterwards would show that, you know, it would seem like she didn't intend at any point to actually go through with it, even though I knew she meant what she said. And this really confused me. I know now that this is just a difference between how men and women love each other. Women love what they see you as a man doing for them. And because of that, we were never going to get through it together. That's just not how it works. When a man says I love you, he means more than just, "Oh, I feel this way right now." And a typical woman, you know, unless a woman is, and I'm not even going to get into the DeWalt discussion, but unless her mind is really wired like a man's mind is, she sees you based on what she thinks she can get out of you. And so it's clear to me now that as soon as things weren't moving, or she could see that things weren't moving in a positive direction for me, I was still trying to help out with my family. I was still struggling with my neurological health, going to doctors. They weren't really helping me, and still aren't to a large degree, but that's a different video, I'm sure. If I ever really get into the details of my migraines and all that kind of stuff. But ultimately, my ex-girlfriend, just as soon as she saw that things weren't going to work out the way she wanted in her idealistic mind, even though there should have been no rational expectation that things were just going to immediately bounce back for me. I had painted myself into a corner. And I'm not saying it was all my fault or that some of it wasn't my fault, but I was in a bad spot. And she nonetheless expected me to basically provide her some utility. And it was not going to happen. And as soon as she saw that it wasn't going to happen, she'd pick fights. She'd get upset. And I'm sure at some subconscious level, she wanted me to break up with her. Because all she would have needed to do was to stop that, was to essentially not overwhelm me. Again, I didn't make the decision to break up with her the last time because of, rationally saying, "Oh, this girl is a bitch and there's just no reason for me to deal with her." It's because I was so overwhelmed that I just couldn't deal. I couldn't handle all the stuff that she was throwing at me, all the fights that she would pick, going to bed mad because I was playing a game on Facebook and told her to hang on, even though she was watching some dumb TV show. It's just, it, she was looking at a subconscious level for a reason to get rid of me or for me to get rid of her. And when I let her loose, and the grass wasn't greener on the other side, at various points, in our history, when the grass wasn't greener on the other side for her, she'd want me back. She'd look at the utility that she thought that I could bring her and say, "Oh, I love Dan again. I want to be with him again." And I realized now this was the mental gymnastics that she was going through. Um, this was how she was perceiving it. But as a man, that's not how I think. That's not how most men think. It's just like, hey, I either want to be with you or I don't. I either like being around you and care about you or I don't, and you can screw off. And so, I really did not understand what was going on. But I got on the internet and I just started typing things. I was in the whole kind of heartbroken, depressed stage, and again, still very overwhelmed by my overall situation. I'm not saying that some people couldn't handle it better, but my own health wasn't very good. I wasn't feeling well, and my family situation was rocky just because of trying to take care of my grandmother's situation, as I've mentioned. And so I was overwhelmed, and I started typing things in like, you know are women evil, that kind of stuff. Are women bad? Or not only that kind of thing, but just like, why do women break up with guys, or why do women quit on relationships? And you know just basically stuff also like how to deal as a man with a woman breaking up with you, or how to deal with a relationship failing as a man, and stuff like that. And that's when I really began to discover the manosphere, the community of support or discussion or whatever you want to call it for men. And you know, basically, at first, of course, I really was just kind of watching whatever would come up. I found some Stardust videos, but his stuff was really beyond me at that point, because Stardust knew what he was talking about and I didn't, basically. But at first I found more of the MRA side of the community, and I found Girl Writes What, Karen Strawn, and I found some videos also by Rocking Mr. E, who I don't watch any of his stuff anymore, but he was one of the first commentators, one of the first YouTube producers that I started watching. And there were also some black gentlemen, Aquasi 100, or the brother of Logic and Common Sense, and some of the videos that he did were really helpful. His early videos where he would talk about the nice guy finishing last, and he'd talk about how women will essentially manipulate situations to get what they want. um, and also Phil from the advice show, he would talk about his divorce and the crazy ex-wife that he had. And I'm not trying to bring any of that kind of discussion necessarily into this, but I heard from many men what feminism had done to women's expectations, what feminism had done to traditional, potentially functioning relationships, and how women today just have all these expectations from men, and that you know men at the same time. I began to learn about the negative side of being a man. I began to learn about how men have always been expected to do for women, and women have never had any sort of similar role. And what all this did was it began to deconstruct what I talked a lot about earlier, which was my total misconception, really my brainwashing, um, that men and women were just the same, and they had the same roles in life and the same roles in relationships, and they were equal, and you could just replace a man with a woman and it would be just as good, and all that nonsense, because that's what it is. It's just nonsense. But ultimately, um, I found a lot of, like I say, the MRA videos, and at first, when I first read about MGTOW, it was kind of from their perspective. It was from a men's rights advocate perspective, um, and basically, a lot of it was negative, like the stuff that Rocking Mr. E said about the MGTOW movement, that it's a cult and all this, and it's just like, at first impression, I was like, yeah, why is it that we don't fight for men to have certain rights? Why is it that we let women get away with expecting such a raw deal and then screwing men over? and yet still having this view that men should have certain gender roles. Yeah, we should fight that kind of thing. But then I realized that that doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. You know, if the whole system is built in a way that favors women, then the first thing you have to do is take yourself out of that system. And that's not what the MRA stand for. And there are other videos that can branch off of this, I'm sure, but I'll just leave it at that, I guess, that MRAs are well intentioned, and I don't necessarily disagree with the core of what they stand for, but if you're part of a system that's failing, you're not helping yourself. And that's what I really needed more than anything at this point. And it continues to be what I need more than anything. That basically I need to help myself to get to a better situation. And advocating for some uphill battle that is probably not going to lead to anything is not a way to help yourself. You can advocate for whatever you want. And again, I'll talk about this in later productions, I'm sure. But ultimately, if you're fighting a battle that you can't win, you're not helping yourself. And I was already fighting battles that I couldn't win. I couldn't make my grandmother well again as much as I wanted to. I couldn't just figure out what to do to make my own health situation better. I couldn't figure out what to do to make my relationship with my ex better, except to just, or my girlfriend at the time, except to just make her go away, which clearly was the best move. And that comes from more of a MGTOW philosophy, obviously, than, advocating for some sort of change. And so, eventually I found more videos about MGTOW, and Turd Flinging Monkey was one of the first channels that I found. I think I discovered his channel, or I started watching his channel shortly after he began producing videos. He only had like maybe 12 or 16 videos, just a small number of videos at the time that I found him. And another YouTube producer who has been off the channel, I guess, who has deleted his channel and hasn't made videos for, I'm sure, well over a year now, maybe close to 2 years. Dark Knight. I really, really digested so many of his videos early on. I just really liked the scientific approach that he had towards things, the rational approach that he had toward his production, or to the content of his videos and how he described everything. And things began to make more and more sense. And from there it followed a fairly predictable path. I discovered Sandman's channel, and then I discovered some of the more involved YouTube channels. Like, I went back to Stardust, and I actually understood a lot more what he was talking about after a period of time. And at that point, I finally really digested the red pill. And what I mean by that is, in this particular instance anyway, what I mean by that is I learned that female nature is very different than male nature, especially when it comes to interacting with the opposite gender, especially when it comes to relationships. And so I finally knew how foolish I had been throughout my relationship history with my ex-girlfriend. I finally realized that we were never going to get through anything together unless it benefited her. That's Brifolt's law, and that's an oversimplified version of Brifolt's law, but that's essentially the kind of core understanding of it all, is that you can't just rely on a woman. You can't just say that everything's going to be okay because I would take care of her, or I would have been supportive of her. And that's, before I figured all this out, that's where I kept going back to in my mind. I was just like, I loved you, and I would have stood by you through thick and thin, whether you had neurological difficulties or you were trying to help your family with something. I wasn't going to find another woman and just replace you. I loved you. And I realize now that in a way she did love me. But as soon as she didn't get what she felt like she needed, as soon as she didn't have someone to settle down with, it was over. It's like it was over before it started, especially after, my health began to fail. And so that's basically where it was. That's where I discovered or came to understand the things that were so confusing to me before. I realized that not every woman's like my ex, but my ex is a pretty typical millennial woman. And I will get more into that in another video where, it's not just about, what my ex did and what she said and everything that happened with her. It's not me trying to overgeneralize because I'm sure that would be a major criticism of everything that I've been saying, because I only had one serious girlfriend. But, every woman that I've had or tried to have some sort of meaningful connection with, virtually every woman, with a few exceptions, has ended up being selfish, solipsistic, who has ended up, just putting herself first, only wanting to have a connection with me when she personally benefited, and just, has been someone who hasn't been supportive. There are just a few women that I can count on one hand, and I think they're all in my family, basically, who were actually supportive of me and actually cared about me beyond what they thought they could get from me. But, the kind of ultimate example, the most extreme example, was with my ex-girlfriend, where I just kept going back to her over and over again. And it wasn't until I had this, I don't know what you would call it, premonition or something, that there was a missing piece to the puzzle. Um, I had this kind of feeling that I was somehow, I guess you could say, in the matrix, to keep with the red pill language. I knew there was something there that I didn't see. I knew there was a missing piece to the puzzle, but I didn't know what it was. But eventually, I came to learn that, oh, okay, the reason why my ex doesn't mean the same thing when she says I love you and we'll get through it together is because it's all based on feeling. It's all based on what she thinks she can get out of me. And as soon as those feelings change, in her mind, she doesn't love me anymore, quote unquote. And, that's basically, for the most part, all there is to say about it. It took a long time, but once I got on the right track and found, MGTOW knowledge, and realized, and along with all this, it's not just all about women. It's also about the role that men are expected to play. The expectation that they'll help out when there's a family situation that needs, some sort of attending to. The expectation that you'll just suck it up if you have a health problem, and that, you'll still put everybody else first. And again, like I mentioned before, I don't regret helping my grandparents. That's not what I mean. But it was the approach and the mentality that I had before that was really naive and really blue pill. And now, I realize that I don't really get anything for these social expectations, that any connection that I have with the person, even in my own family, there, has to involve some sort of mutual benefit. And that, ultimately, if I don't look at my own health and my own well-being and my own future for what it is, that nobody else will, for the most part, with maybe a few exceptions. My father's been really supportive, but for the most part, my grandfather and I are still close, but mostly there are just a few people that I could count on. Like I mentioned before, I can count them on one hand. And there are very few women that you can count on, because my ex, like I say, not every woman is like my ex, but my ex is a very typical millennial woman. And, ultimately, I realize now that I need to go my own way. I realize that it's my life that I have to focus on, and that you can't rely on a woman to get through things together with you, that you have to focus on your life for what it is, and that if you want to give a woman time and attention, that's up to you. But that ultimately, all this incorporates the roles that men are expected to play and the raw deal that men usually get when it comes to being kind and when it comes to doing for women and doing for people generally. Once you come to understand men's real position in society, like I have, basically you have to realize that MGTOW is the way to go, because any other way is just unhealthy. And any other way can lead you into a negative relationship, like what I had with my ex, when I really just did not understand what was going on. But ultimately now I realize that people like her are people to be avoided, and there's no way that I'll ever have anything to do with her again, because there's no reason for me to. And ultimately, like I say, I guess the good in all this is that I've come to realize what male and female nature is, and that men and women are different. But you know, the most important thing, I think, is that you've got to go your own way. You've got to have a philosophy of whatever sort that says, as an individual man, I will take care of myself. I will determine what is good for my life. I will determine, what it means to be a good man, and I'll move forward on that basis and not on the basis of doing what other people, particularly women, expect you to do.